It began with silence and ended in execution. Not on a battlefield, but in a courtyard. Not by foreign enemies, but by fellow countrymen. A dictator once worshipped was now kicked and spat on by the very people who once raised his banners. Italy did not simply lose a war in the 1940s. It imploded. Brother turned against brother. A government turned against its creator. And a nation, once united under the black banner of fascism, tore itself apart not for conquest but for identity. So, how did it come to this? How did the nation of Rome, Caesar, and the Renaissance fall into a civil war within a world war? And more importantly, what ghosts of that war still echo in the marble corridors of Italian politics today? By the spring of 1943, Benito Mussolini's hold on Italy was unraveling like an ancient tapestry soaked in war. To the outside world, Il Duce was still the iron-fisted architect of fascism. But behind palace walls, even his own allies whispered his downfall. Bombs rained on Italian cities. Sicily had fallen. The people were hungry, afraid, exhausted, and most damning of all, the dream was failing. Mussolini's Italy had joined Hitler's Germany in hopes of carving out a Mediterranean empire. Instead, it was crumbling under the weight of its own ambition. And at the heart of this crisis stood King Victor Emmanuel III, a monarch in title, but one who had long hidden behind Mussolini's shadow to preserve his throne. Now, with Rome teetering, the king faced a choice: remain loyal to Il Duce or throw him to the wolves. But this decision would not be made in a battlefield bunker, nor on the front lines. It would be made in a conference room. On the evening of July 24th, 1943, the Grand Council of Fascism gathered at the Palazzo Venezia. The mood was thick with tension. Outside, black-shirted guards paced nervously. Inside, Dino Grandi, once a loyal fascist, clutched 2 hand grenades beneath his jacket, prepared to die if this turned violent. Mussolini entered without his usual bodyguard, fully expecting to browbeat his council into submission. Instead, he was met with silence, and then rebellion. Grandi delivered a scathing rebuke of Mussolini's leadership, calling on the king to take back control. When the council erupted into argument, it was Grandi who made history. He called for a vote. It would be the first and last democratic vote ever held by that body. 9 hours later, Mussolini lost. The next day, the king summoned him to the palace, and with no ceremony, no trial, no defense, Benito Mussolini was dismissed and arrested. Italy, at least on the surface, had flipped, but removing a dictator does not remove a regime, and betraying an alliance does not end a war. Italy's nightmare had only just begun. King Victor Emmanuel appointed Marshal Pietro Badoglio as the new prime minister, a conservative general who opposed Mussolini, but not authoritarianism. The king believed Badoglio could preserve the monarchy, strike peace with the Allies, and restore order. But reality had other plans. German forces, now deeply entrenched across northern Italy, viewed Mussolini's fall as treachery. And Hitler was not a man known for forgiveness. 8 full German divisions began streaming into Italy on the same day Mussolini was arrested. Meanwhile, Badoglio and the king hesitated, uncertain whether the Allies would support them or use them. It would take 45 days of secret negotiations before an armistice was signed. But by then, it was too late. On September 8th, 1943, Italy officially exited the Axis powers. The very next day, German troops launched Operation Oxe, seizing key Italian cities, disarming local forces, and establishing a puppet regime. Rome descended into chaos. Government officials fled south. Civilians panicked. Naples, once a proud city of art and industry, became a battleground. Colonel Walter Scholl, a German commander, declared that for every German soldier killed, 100 Italians would be executed. He ordered evacuations. He threatened forced labor. He announced plans to destroy the city's port to prevent Allied use. But something unexpected happened. The people of Naples, exhausted, furious, and armed with little more than kitchen knives and stolen rifles, revolted. They poured into the streets. They formed barricades. They hunted down collaborators. For 4 days, the Neapolitan resistance, barely coordinated but fiercely determined, fought the occupiers. On the 5th day, the Germans retreated. The port was saved. The uprising had worked. But this was not just a local victory, it was a warning shot. Italy would not be conquered again. Not by foreigners, and not by fascists. Meanwhile, in a remote mountain fortress at Gran Sasso, Benito Mussolini sat in guarded captivity. For a brief moment, the Allies were unsure what to do with him. They wouldn't have to decide. On September 12th, 1943, a squad of German special forces, led by Otto Skorzeny, swooped in via glider and freed the deposed dictator without firing a shot. Hitler, ever theatrical, had resurrected his ally. But Mussolini would not return as a ruler. He would return as a symbol, a puppet. The Germans installed him as the head of the Italian Social Republic, a Nazi-controlled regime based in the north. Its capital? Salo, a sleepy lakeside town now forever tied to fascism's final days. Mussolini had no real power. The Nazis controlled the army, the treasury, and the government. Mussolini's only true domain was terror. He reassembled his personal militia, the Black Brigades, a force of fanatical loyalists tasked with crushing dissent. Their methods? Torture, execution, massacre. But instead of quelling the population, their brutality sparked a second war. Not between nations, but within Italy itself. The Black Brigades marched in black uniforms under black flags, but they could not stamp out the rising flame in the mountains. There, across the craggy peaks and alpine valleys of northern Italy, a different army was forming, nameless, fractured, but unbreakable. They were the partigiani, the partisans. They were students, deserters, workers, outlaws, and revolutionaries. Their numbers were small at first, a few thousand, mostly communists, hidden in forests and farms. But with every act of repression, with every German convoy that rolled into town, their ranks swelled. Entire families fled to the mountains. Young men who had escaped Mussolini's new conscription quietly dug trenches. Railway lines were sabotaged. Bridges collapsed in the dead of night. Ammunition depots erupted in fire. To Mussolini and his new regime, these were not Italians. They were traitors. Rebels. Vermin. But to much of the population, they were heroes. Still, the lines were far from clear. Some of these early partisan bands were little more than bandits robbing peasants and spreading fear. Others fought under the banner of communist revolution, dreaming not just of liberating Italy, but of remaking it. The Allies, too, were watching, and they were wary. By early 1944, the partisan groups had unified under a new political front, the CLN, or Comitato di Liberazione Nazionale, the Committee of National Liberation. And in the north, a separate offshoot was born, the CLNAI. Its aim was open war against the Italian Social Republic. From their mountain hideouts, the partisans launched hit-and-run attacks on RSI and German forces alike. Their tactics, crude but effective, created chaos across the Po Valley. Factories stopped working. Train lines lay in ruin. Morale plummeted. Mussolini's response was brutal and indiscriminate. In March of 1944, a general strike in Milan brought the city to a standstill. Workers refused to build weapons for the Nazis. In response, thousands were arrested. Many were sent to German labor camps. Few returned. The final thread holding Italian civil society together began to fray. Then came the massacres. In March of 1944, following a partisan attack that killed 33 German soldiers in Rome, Nazi troops with Black Brigade support executed 335 civilians in the Ardeatine caves. There was no trial, no proof, no names, just numbers. Later that year, in the village of Sant'Anna di Stasima, more than 500 civilians, including women and children, were rounded up and shot by Nazi and fascist forces. Not a single partisan had been found there. These were not just acts of retaliation. They were messages, submission, or annihilation. But the message backfired. From the end of 1943 to the summer of 1944, the number of active partisans exploded from under 9,000 to over 30,000. Mussolini had sparked the war within, but it was the people who would decide its end. Despite the momentum, Italy's liberation did not arrive quickly. By winter, the Allies had stalled. British General Harold Alexander declared that no major operations would resume until spring. The mountains were frozen, the terrain impossible. The partisans, now exposed and running low on supplies, were driven from their strongholds. German and RSI forces surged back into rural areas, restoring control in name but never truly in spirit. There was also a deeper problem: ideology. Roughly 70% of the northern partisans were communists, many aligned with the Italian Communist Party. For Britain and the United States, this was a growing concern. Would Italy trade one form of tyranny for another? To prevent that outcome, Allied leaders pushed for an uneasy compromise. In early 1945, the two wings of the partisan movement signed the Rome Protocols. Under this deal, the partisans agreed to disarm once the war ended in exchange for Allied support and recognition during the fight. But behind the handshake, distrust lingered. The communists believed they had earned the right to shape Italy's future not with words, but with blood. Many within the CLN feared the Allies would try to shut them out once fascism was defeated. As spring approached, the stakes could not have been higher. April 1945. The Gothic Line, Germany's last defensive barrier in Italy, cracked under Allied assault. It was the final blow. The German front collapsed. In tandem, the Italian Communist Party issued a call to arms to all partisans: rise now or miss the moment. In cities like Turin, Milan, and Genoa, workers walked off the job. Partisan cells flooded into the streets. Black brigades were overwhelmed. Police stations surrendered. Within days, the Po Valley was no longer under fascist control. It was in full-scale uprising. In Milan, Mussolini watched the chaos unfold with numb disbelief. His armies were in retreat, his regime had no future, and his dreams of glory long since replaced by fear. On April 25th, he fled the city, joining a retreating column of German soldiers, hoping to reach the mountainous stronghold of Valtellina. His plan? A last stand, or perhaps a quiet surrender. But near Lake Como, the convoy was stopped by partisans. The Germans, eager to survive, negotiated a trade: freedom in exchange for the Italians. The partisans agreed. Mussolini, his mistress Clara Petacci, and several fascist officials were handed over. Within 24 hours, the dictator was dead. His body, riddled with bullets, was hung upside down in Milan's Piazzale Loreto, the same square where fascists had once displayed partisan corpses. Now, it was Mussolini's turn. Civilians spat on him, kicked his corpse, cursed his name. The black banner of fascism was not just torn down, it was buried in blood. Mussolini's death was not the end of the war. It was the opening of a void. As the Germans fled north, chased by the Allied armies, a new question emerged, one more dangerous than any tank or bomb. Who now ruled Italy? The CLNAI, the northern branch of the resistance, acted fast. With over 250,000 partisans in the field, they overwhelmed the remaining fascist militias. Black brigades surrendered or melted into the countryside. Some were captured, some were lynched, others simply disappeared. But power abhors a vacuum, and not all partisans wanted the same future. Radical communists saw this moment as their opportunity, not just to destroy fascism, but to build socialism in its place. Improvised courts sprang up across liberated towns. Trials were quick. Verdicts were often predetermined. Executions were carried out in back alleys and public squares. Fascist mayors, collaborator journalists, black shirt officers, anyone even suspected of having served Mussolini's regime was at risk. To the Allies, it looked dangerously close to Bolshevik revolution. To the Italian people, it looked like vengeance. And vengeance does not build a country. By May of 1945, Allied forces had fully liberated Italy. Nazi Germany had surrendered. World War II in Europe was over, but Italy's internal reckoning had only begun. In exile, King Victor Emmanuel III had watched events unfold with increasing anxiety. He had been complicit in Mussolini's rise and had fled when the country needed leadership most. Now, his very legitimacy was in question. In an act of desperation, he abdicated in favor of his son, Umberto II, in hopes that a younger face might preserve the monarchy. But it was too late. A national referendum was held in June of 1946, asking Italians whether they wished to remain a monarchy or become a republic. The result? 54% voted for a republic. It was not an overwhelming majority, but it was decisive. The House of Savoy, which had ruled Italy since unification, was exiled. The monarchy was abolished, a new constitution was drafted, and the Republic of Italy was born. But peace would not come so easily. Even as Italians celebrated liberation, the scars of civil war ran deep. The CLN, the very body that had led the resistance, now fractured along ideological lines. Socialists, communists, Christian Democrats, and liberals all jostled for power in the new republic. Worse still, the United States and Britain had made it clear they would not allow Italy to become another Eastern Bloc state. The Italian Communist Party, which had played a central role in defeating fascism, was now treated with suspicion. Surveillance increased. Funds flowed into opposing parties. The CIA would soon begin covert operations to prevent leftist victories in future elections. The Cold War had arrived in Italy not by invasion, but through the ballot box. To avoid civil collapse, Palmiro Togliatti, leader of the Communist Party, proposed a radical solution: a general amnesty. On June 22, 1946, the Togliatti amnesty was passed. It pardoned crimes committed both by fascists and communists during the war. Thousands of former Black Brigade members were released. Thousands of partisan executions were never prosecuted. It was, in essence, a deal with memory. Let the past die, so the Republic might live. But forgetting is not forgiving. Chapter X: Legacy of a Broken Nation. In the years that followed, Italy rebuilt. Marshall Plan funds flowed in. Cities were reconstructed. Factories restarted. Tourism returned. By the 1960s, Italy was a thriving economy and a founding member of NATO and the European Economic Community. But beneath the surface, the ghosts of civil war lingered. Mussolini's grave in Predappio became a shrine for neo-fascists, a site of yearly pilgrimages. Some Italians, particularly in the South, still viewed him as a symbol of national strength. Others spat at the mention of his name. Political movements in post-war Italy remained polarized. The Christian Democrats dominated early elections, but the Communist Party remained one of the largest in Europe. The left and right viewed each other not just as opponents but as existential threats. Even today, the memory of the Italian Civil War is fractured. To some, the partisans were liberators. To others, they were vengeful executioners. To some, Mussolini was a tyrant. To others, a misunderstood nationalist. There is no single narrative, only fragments. And perhaps that is the truest legacy of Italy's flip in World War II. Not that it chose the Allies, but that it chose to survive. Italy survived the war, but not without cost. By the summer of 1946, the Republic was real yet fragile. Beneath the celebratory flags and rebuilding cities, a more philosophical question lingered. What had Italy really won? It had removed Mussolini, yes. It had cast off Nazi occupation, yes. It had even managed, against all odds, to vote out a monarchy that had stood for nearly a century. But at what price? The war within the Italian Civil War left over 100,000 dead. Tens of thousands more had been imprisoned, tortured, or displaced. Cities like Milan, Genoa, and Naples had not just been bombed by the Allies, they had been bled by their own countrymen. There were stories, still whispered in village bars and family homes, of neighbors denouncing neighbors, of stolen homes, of black shirts turned partisans to escape revenge. Justice was inconsistent. Memory was selective, and the silence of fathers became the shame of sons. Even as the world celebrated Nazi Germany's defeat, Italy's soul was still trapped in a fog of moral ambiguity. Was Mussolini's fall a revolution or a palace coup? Were the partisans freedom fighters or opportunists? Had the monarchy been complicit in fascism or its hostage? No tribunal could answer these questions. No constitution could rewrite what had already been lived. Today, Italy stands as a modern democracy, a member of the European Union, and one of the world's cultural giants. And yet, every year, in the town of Predapio, fascist sympathizers gather at Mussolini's tomb. Every year, veterans of the partisan brigades hold solemn reunions in the north. Every year, debates rage in parliament, in universities, and on television about what really happened between 1943 and 1945. It is a war Italy still fights, not with bullets, but with memory. And memory, unlike war, does not end. Children grow up hearing different stories. Statues are erected and then torn down. Streets are renamed, then renamed again. Italy flipped sides in World War II. But the greater flip was not on the battlefield. It was in the soul of a nation the choice to confront itself, or to hide behind myths. Some historians call it a civil war. Others call it a purge. But perhaps it was something stranger, a reckoning. The moment when Italy, ancient, beautiful, wounded, had to choose whether it was a country of empire or a country of people. That question still lingers, like smoke in the cathedrals and silence in the hills. Empires do not collapse in a single day. They decay from within, not by invasion, but by erosion. Italy's greatest war was not fought in North Africa, nor in the snows of Russia, nor even on the beaches of Salerno. It was fought in council chambers, in village squares, in alleyways, after curfew. It was fought between those who believed in fear and those who dared to believe in something else. And though the war is over, its echo is not. Perhaps that is why, even now, Mussolini's name can still provoke cheers and curses in equal measure. Italy flipped sides, yes, but it also flipped narratives, flipped loyalties, flipped history itself, and in doing so, it gave us one of the most profound lessons of the 20th century, that the battle for a nation's future is often decided not by who invades from abroad, but by who stands up from within.